want to mention that this part of the conference is sponsored by the Center for Comparative Constitutionalism, which was founded about 5 years ago to foster the more comparative study of these issues. And now I want to introduce my colleague Jeff Stone to introduce Justice Sachs. Professor Stone was the Dean of the Law School for many years and then Provost of the university. His book, Perilous Times, about free speech in wartime, has won all kinds of awards, and he's now at work on a really wonderful book about sex and the U.S. Constitution called Sexing the Constitution. So, Jeff.
Thank you, Martha. Very few people can say with a straight face that they prefer not to be called a hero. In my experience, most people who say they prefer not to be called a hero haven't actually earned the right to be called one. Their purported modesty is merely a ruse designed to imply that they are both heroic and modest, when in fact they are neither. Justice Albie Sachs is the exception. He is a genuine hero who is also sincerely modest about his heroism. More accurately, he doesn't want the burden of his heroism. As he once put the point, I sometimes joke that if you're a hero, you're expected to conduct yourself well. By eschewing the title of hero, Justice Sachs has claimed for himself the right to conduct himself badly. I admire that. So I will not describe him as a hero. He is merely a good man with heroic tendencies. Albie Sachs began his human rights activism in the early 1950s when he was a second-year law student at the University of Cape Town. He was first arrested for sitting in to protest racial segregation. Such anti-apartheid conduct in South Africa in the 1950s was not for the faint of heart. It was deadly serious business. After receiving his law degree, Justice Sachs immediately began defending his countrymen who were being charged under racist and repressive South African security laws. He was himself continually harassed by the police, subjected to banning orders that restricted his freedom of movement, and arrested without trial and placed in solitary confinement for 2 prolonged periods of detention, totaling 168 consecutive days. Reflecting on that experience, Justice Sachs recalled the emotional strain of solitary confinement. Over time, he said, you forget the outside world. You are driven into yourself. Eventually, you don't quite remember what it's all about or even precisely why you're there. In moments, he said, what kept me going was not the struggle for justice, not questions of politics or ideology, but simply a personal sense of honor. I'm not going to break because I'm not going to break. In 1966, at the age of 31, Albie Sachs went into exile. After 11 years teaching law in England, he spent the next 11 years in Mozambique as a law professor and legal activist. During this time, Justice Sachs worked closely with Oliver Tambo, the exiled leader of the African National Congress, and he helped draft the ANC's Code of Conduct and its constitution. In 1988, Albie Sachs was blown up by a bomb placed in his car in Maputo by South African security agents, costing him an arm and the sight in one eye. After a long and debilitating recovery, he rededicated himself to the cause of freedom and devoted himself full-time to preparing for a new democratic South Africa. In 1990, after almost a quarter of a century in exile, Albie Sachs returned home. As a member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC, he played a central role in the negotiations that led eventually to South Africa becoming a constitutional democracy. After the first democratic election in 1994, he was appointed by President Nelson Mandela to serve on South Africa's newly established constitutional court. Summarizing his own personal journey within the history of South Africa, Justice Sachs once observed, there is a validation of one's life, of the things one has suffered, of the discomforts and the terror. In a way, everything makes sense. It was justified, and that's thrilling. It gives one courage about the world, that it's possible to have simple beliefs about human goodness and about the capacity of people to learn and to change and to transform their lives. When asked what lessons we might draw from his struggles and experience, Justice Sachs replied, don't be afraid to find the good in others, to listen to others, to try to understand their positions. There's a lot of power, he said, in forgiveness and reconciliation and listening, in putting yourself in the shoes of the other person. Such is the credo of a hero, whether he wants to be one or not. It's my pleasure to introduce freedom fighter, civil rights lawyer, diarist, scholar, and distinguished jurist, Justice Albie Sachs.
I still insist the hero is a sandwich you can get in New York. and it's not modesty. In fact, it doesn't belong to that realm. It's the experience of my generation. I happen to be here because of my mutilated arm. The trauma that I suffered is visible, and it becomes very easy to cast me in the role of a hero. But I actually find it a burden. I want you to listen what I, Albie Sachs, am going to say, just as a person who's here with you, sharing some experiences related to the topic of today and things that I've been through in my life as a lawyer, as a person. And then can I just say that in many ways I think this is a very wonderful conference, but I can't attend more sessions. For a very, very simple reason. You need it here, but you are dealing with hypotheticals. We are dealing with experience. You couldn't have a conference like this in Argentina. You couldn't have a conference like this in Chile. You couldn't have had a conference like this in Portugal after 1974. Because the historic experience of torture and being tortured and what it meant to our society was so powerful and so overwhelming. The idea of concocting imaginary situations and balancing out instrumental proportionalities would be horrific in itself. Torture involves shame. Torture involves standards. Torture involves a morality of a society and of a country. That's been our experience. And that's a little prelude to what I'm going to say. And what I'm going to say starts innocuously. I was 39 years old, quietly teaching laws in exile at Southampton University, when I discovered I was a terrorist. I've been invited to attend a conference at Yale University, Contemporary History on Developments in South Africa. And I knew that I wouldn't get a visa to attend that conference. Why? Because I was a member of the ANC, African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela, who had been Commander-in-Chief of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the nation, the spear of the nation, trying to overthrow apartheid in South Africa. And because I was a member of the ANC, I was a terrorist. A few months later, when I was still mulling over the invitation, the lobby group in Washington in favor of the ANC turned out to be stronger than the lobby group of the then South African government. And so the policy was changed, and I was no longer a terrorist. Hooray. It wasn't simply an ignoble label to which we objected. Being treated as a terrorist had enormous consequences for thousands and thousands and thousands of us. As terrorists, we could be detained without trial, in solitary confinement, no access to family, to lawyers, to anybody. Why? Because they were combating terrorism. The total onslaught against apartheid. And they would bring in the Soviet Union and a bit of racism against Black Africa, and a whole series of threats. The Black Peril, the Red Peril, when China became more powerful, the Yellow Peril, were all somehow harnessed to justify the attack against terrorism, or as it was seen, the self-defense of the society as it existed against terrorist attacks. And you quoted just briefly from one little passage in the book I wrote, The Jail Diary of Albie Sachs. And it was a ghastly experience for me, partly discovering how difficult it was to be brave. You thought you simply bared your chest, you felt strong, you had conviction and belief in your cause, it was a just cause, and you stood out. The stereotype of stoicism that I was reading about in one of the papers. And in reality, it was extremely difficult. You are living in a little concrete cube. You stare at your toes, you stare at the wall, your toes the wall, the toes the wall. You don't know how long it's going to last. There's nothing to do, there's no one to speak to. It's an inhuman existence. People live because we are in communities. We live with other people. There might be a few individuals who's a matter of spiritual testing will sit up on a column somewhere, or I have a friend who's a Buddhist nun, she's going to be silent for a month or 2 months. She's in control, it's her choice. This is a non-chosen kind of a situation designed to break you down because of isolation. And I can still remember I would try to occupy myself and feel like a valid, real human being. And I would use trying to remember all the states in the United States of America. And I think I once got up to about 43. But I couldn't write them down, I'd have to go through the alphabet. So I didn't even know how many I'd got to. I had 2 arms then, so at least I could count up to 10. And then I started singing songs. Always. Because Charmaine was quite an interesting little profile of the hit tunes of 1963, late 1963. And I mentioned in passing, the whole world knew that President Kennedy had been assassinated, except for one person, that was me. For about a week I didn't know. I was totally cut off from it. And I would sing, trying to feel I'm a human being, I'm a person. I'll be living here always, year after year, always, in this little cell that I know so well. I'll be living swell, always. And I'd kind of be amused that I'm using the Noel Coward version of Irving Berlin. 2 people not noted as great freedom fighters to keep my spirits up. I'll be staying in always, keeping up my chin always, not for but an hour, not for but a week, not for 90 days, but always. It was called the 90-day law. And you could be locked up for 90 days, and after 90 days, I'm scratching on the wall like good prisoners do, and it's the 90th day, and I'm released, and I'm given my tie back, and I'm given my suit back that I got when I was in chambers when I was arrested. I'm given my watch back, and I say, I'm free, and he says, you're free, and as I'm walking out to the street, Sergeant comes up to me, he actually shook my hand and said, I'm placing you under arrest, and I went back in again. 90 days, but it will be another 90 days, and another 90 days, and another 90 days. Once you open that door, or really you close the door to the rule of law, to habeas corpus, to standards of fair interrogation, fair trial, it's never enough. The security people always want more. And so they asked for 15 days, and 90 days, and 180 days, and eventually it became endless. That was the first detention. 2 years later, and you don't get stronger each time you're detained, it's what I call torture by sleep deprivation. And keeping me up through the day, through the night, a team of interrogators shouting at me, banging the table for 10 minutes, total silence for 10 minutes, and replacing, rotating all the time. And when I asked for some food, they seemed delighted, and from what emerged afterwards, I'm fairly sure there was some drug in the food. And the next morning, I feel my body is fighting my will, my mind. The desire to sleep, to collapse, is just overwhelming. And I'd heard of other people who held out for 4 days, for 5 days, for 7 days, and the longer they held out, the more they broke afterwards. They had no control whatsoever. And this was a tussle. It wasn't even about information. It was about breaking me. It was about showing that they were stronger, that they were more powerful. I recall now, I wasn't thinking these things at the time, Jean-Paul Sartre writing about the torture in Algeria. And he said it wasn't even primarily to get information, it was to destroy the will, the confidence, the self-esteem of the people concerned. It had a very powerful racist dimension. You had to dehumanize the person you were torturing. That person ceases to be a human being. And you are then justified in doing what you're doing. Even more than justified. You're not only entitled to do, you're obliged to do what you're doing because you're combating a kind of an evil, of an inferior kind of a person. And in some ways, I was even more terrible than the black people to whom the racist ill-treatment had been historically applied, because I was that evil white mastermind who was stirring up the innocent black people to feel that they had injustices when in fact they were really quite happy with their life under the apartheid. It was the worst moment of my life. It wasn't a hypothetical situation. I collapsed on the floor, they poured water on me, they lifted me up. I still remember those thick, heavy fingers prizing my eyes open. I collapsed again, more water, the shoes, that sense of triumph that they had, that they were now breaking me, destroying my resistance. Any information I had at that stage was pretty old. They wanted the information possibly to get me to be a witness against somebody who'd been in resistance with me. And that would be a double triumph, because then I would become a traitor. Then I would become an instrument of the state being used against the others as well. These were the objectives. There were no ticking bombs involved. It was a question of hegemony, dominance, power, control, mastery. And we found in so many of the other cases that physical abuse of the people and the physical abuse of women and the rapes that took place in Chile and to some extent in South Africa were all part and parcel of what's involved. These were not, I repeat, these were not hypotheticals. These were experiences, and not just for a few individuals who unfortunately happened to be in the hands of sadists. It was instrumental, it was organized, it was condoned, it was part of policy. It was part of that whole system of white supremacy and domination in our country. And retaining an unjust system by using methods which were so ugly and awful that they were hidden. They were denied. The detention without trial, that was open. And they would come to court and they would deny that these things happened. And the judges would look and they wouldn't see the blood flowing, and they wouldn't see the broken bones, and they wouldn't see any damage. They would just see a person there months afterwards and say, where's the proof of the torture? Why should we believe these allegations? And the judges themselves feeling threatened by what they regarded as the attacks on society and law and order in the country in which they lived. I remember, and it's in the soft benches very early on, and I'm saying because it's not a post, what's a Proctor Hoc kind of addition, thinking to myself, if ever one day I am in a position of power and authority, I will never do this to another human being. And the psychologists who are here, I'm sure, will understand, when you are totally powerless, you try to imagine yourself in a situation of power. And what's the greatest power you can exert? It's not to do to them what they're doing to you. That's the same power. And you're so weak that it's not even feasible, it's not even imaginable. The greatest power is to say, and I'm not being suppressed and subordinated by what they're doing to me. That I have a superior set of standards and values. I have beliefs that are deep. I am a human being. I'm fighting for justice. I'm fighting for freedom. And somehow the power of that belief being extended to those who are causing so much harm to me became a motive force in my life. I later on wrote a book called The Soft Vengeance of the Freedom Fighter. The soft vengeance after I was blown up, the soft vengeance was to get democracy, it was to get freedom. A much more powerful vengeance than to subject the people who've done this to us to what they've done. Because then we become like them. Then we become gangsters and crooks and thugs, only with a better apparel, with a better cause, with a better claim maybe, a better motivation. but we are like them. And they dragged us down to be like them. And we become like them. And our souls are like their souls. And our inhumanity is like their inhumanity. What made it particularly ironical and paradoxical and in some ways hurtful for us, for terrorists, was that in fact we were anti-terrorism. This was an age of ideology. I'm speaking about the late 60s, early 70s. Isms were all over the place. Capitalism, socialism, imperialism, communism. Only social democracy didn't fit into the isms. And one of the isms that we denounced in our movement, ideologically, as a matter of principle, was terrorism. Terrorism was wrong. Terrorism was indiscriminate violence being directed at people because they happened to belong to a particular group, a race, a community. It was totally unpolitical. It was totally antithetical. We were fighting for justice against a system of white supremacy, not against a race. And this lesson was done in and repeated, I won't say ad nauseum, but endlessly, as a kind of a mantra. And for years we believed in nonviolence, and that was one reason for the nonviolence, to avoid an ultimate racial bloodbath that would tear our country to bits, from which we could never recover. When the Black September movement, I think it was late 1960s, early 70s, looking for spectacular plane hijacks, a lot of the younger members of the ANC in exile said, what's the matter with our leadership? Why aren't we doing that? They are putting their struggle on the map. People pay attention to their cause. And our leadership said no, 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 no. It wasn't simply that Oliver Tambo might have been traveling on a plane or somebody else who's a supporter of ours. It wasn't based on that. It was based on who, what we call the enemy was. If the enemy is a people, it's a population, that's not what our struggle is about. The enemy was a system of injustice. And we tackle that system of injustice and we go using proportionate methods that might involve violence, directly aimed at the physical power and control of that system. But there was a concern that our manifestly just cause against apartheid, against institutionalized racism, would not become diluted. Now it seems simply as a survival struggle, not as a justice struggle. But I'm convinced the real reason, the deep reason that Oliver Tambo in particular, the acting president of the ANC in exile, was because we are not like that. We are not like that. What does it do to you? What kind of person are you? How can you claim to be a freedom fighter when you kill indiscriminately like that? I'm sure that was the deep underlying morality. And it was a morality that turned out to be very powerful and very strong inside the ANC. It managed to survive 30 years of exile without any major disputes and breakups, which to all other exile movements splintered into various groups. We held together because we had a very profound moral philosophy at the heart of what we were trying to do. In 1985, and I mentioned the date, it had nothing to do with the Berlin Wall. Perestroika was just about beginning. It wasn't related to external international factors. We had intense debates inside the ANC, in exile now. And we had a conference in a small town called Kabwe in Zimbabwe, with Zambian troops surrounding the conference hall in case South African commandos came to blow us up. It was serious. It was very, very serious. What could happen? And the two themes that I remember in particular being discussed, one related to the question of permissible tactics and strategy of struggle. And I recall King Sabata Dalindyebo, who'd been forced into exile, a leader of the African people in the Eastern Cape, who was patriotic. Many of the chiefs were students of Pretoria. They got their motor cars and their stipends, and they oppressed the people. He wasn't like that. And he made a speech on the question of permissible methods of struggle. And he spoke in Xhosa, the African language. So the small number of us who were culturally backward, who couldn't understand the African language, African people have to understand English, the oppressor's language. The oppressors don't have to understand the language of the dominated group. And he's speaking in a very animated way, and the audience laugh. And then we hear the translation afterwards, so like 5 minutes later we laugh. So it went on through the proceedings. And he told the following story. He said, two men are fighting. It's a stick fight. It's a bitter fight. They're very angry. And their wives are urging them on. And the wife of man A says, "What's the matter, my husband? You are much stronger than him. You're a better fighter than him. But he's defeating you. Your problem is you are using a stick in one hand and you're using your other hand to hold up a blanket to cover your nakedness. Drop the damn blanket and fight with both hands and you'll mess him up." And that's when everybody laughed. And when I heard it in English, that's when I laughed. And what he was saying was the ANC is restricting itself in its capacity to hit back. And people were saying, until the whites cry when they bury their children, they will never understand our suffering. In a very African way, the audience just laughed quietly and gently. "We get your point, it's a good story, it's a powerful story," and they moved on. I would have jumped up and said, "Comrade King, the long-standing policy of the ANC has been to resist terrorism as an instrument of struggle because blah, 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 blah," in a very abstract way. The African way was to hear it out, to laugh, to smile, and to move on, as if to say, "We're very happy you've joined us, you're with us, we want you to be on our side in the struggle," but it's actually a rather crude form of political representation that you're going in for. It's not our policy. And the conference firmly rejected any idea of using terrorism. The other theme, and a major theme in which I was directly involved, was the question of torture. I'd been invited by Oliver Tambo, I was then working for the Ministry of Justice in Mozambique, to come to speak to him about an important matter in Lusaka, where the ANC had its headquarters in Exile. I'm very curious to know what it was. I get there and ask about the weather in Mozambique and the work in Mozambique, and eventually comes to the point. And I still remember so vividly, he had a rolled up piece of newspaper and he was swatting flies as he's speaking to me, but doing it not like you expect a president to have a fly swatter who stands around and gets rid of these terrible little things, but he was like doing it himself. And he said, "You know, we have a problem in the ANC. We've captured a number of people who we believe were sent by Pretoria to try and destroy the organization. We don't have any standards, we don't have any regulations. We simply have a constitution that deals with annual general meetings, electing the leadership and so on, and the policy of the organization. And we find that there's a gap, and we need something." And he said, "I'm sure it's very difficult to get appropriate regulation." And in my confident way, I said, "It's not difficult at all. The international conventions make it very clear, no torture, inhuman or degrading treatment." He said, "We use torture." He said it with a bleak face. I couldn't believe it. The ANC, an organization fighting for freedom, using torture. It turned out afterwards that in the camps in Angola where they had caught people who'd been infiltrated to destroy and controversies, that torture was being used in There was an investigation. He'd made an inquiry. He'd got enough facts to show prima facie it was torture. And now he was calling me in as a legal person to help the organization set the standards. And in the Oliver Tambo way, he didn't then, as president of the organization in exile, issue a declaration or a statement setting out what the standards should be. He made it a question to be debated by the organization at a conference. And he asked me to do a draft of what was called a code of conduct. In effect, it was a whole code of criminal law and procedure for an organization in exile, adapted to our circumstances, where we didn't have proper investigators, we didn't have proper prisons, we didn't have judges, we didn't have prosecutors. How could we establish a kind of an internal rule of law for a liberation organization where the countries that hosted us expected us to attend to our problems? They didn't want these matters to come out and burden their courts. We had to attend to them. Of all the legal documents I've written in my life, a tiny note I smuggled out after I'd been tortured by sleep deprivation, and this document are far and away the most important documents I've done. And the code of conduct was put to the membership in exile and some in the underground to be discussed in advance and for them to take resolutions on the question. Because he believed a question like this is not something to be determined by the president as a matter of principle imposed on the organization. It's something that the organization itself must assume. It must understand it, it must internalize it, it must identify with the issues and be very, very clear. And I remember so vividly the debate. And the only issue in doubt was whether there should be a kind of a clawback statement, no torture, no inhuman, degrading punishment or treatment allowed. There would be a charge, there would be defense people appointed, there would be the rights of appeal, there would be classification of different offences from just being a gadfly at an ordinary meeting where you're getting everybody's nerves, where you didn't need any repressive thing, to people who were crashing motor cars, who were stealing money, who were assaulting women, to people who are being sent in to destroy the organization. We have 3 levels, classifications of responses. And the one issue for debate was, should there be allowance made for what was called intensive methods of interrogation in extreme circumstances. And one by one, the young people, the soldiers in the controversies, came up to the platform and they said, no. The minute you allow any exceptions or exemptions, they will be used. They will be used by security. You are breaking the membrane. You have to have very, very clear standards. No torture. In no circumstances. It's not the kind of people we are. It's not what we do. They didn't even say, well, you have some torture. Can it be electric shock torture? Can you torture someone to death because of the ticking bomb? Can you stick knives into people? Why don't you allow that, but you allow other kinds of things? It didn't even reach that level of comparing hypotheticals and examples. It was a powerful statement about who we were, what we were fighting for, what our morality and core values were. That was what was at stake. And they'd seen in practice how the torture had dehumanized the torturers who'd been their comrades, their friends, who'd left university like they had to join the freedom struggle, who had now become brutes. To deal with brutes as they saw it, they felt they could be brutes themselves. They didn't want to belong to an organization that engaged in that kind of activity. It had to be outlawed, clearly, emphatically. It was an extraordinary moment for me, because here we were in exile, in parlous conditions, and yet we were fighting for the morality. I still remember one person saying, going up, and he said, we are fighting for life. We are fighting for life. how can we be against life? He didn't just mean life or death, he meant life, the human personality, human dignity. How can we be against that? And these were young people. It was so emotional for me because it corresponded to what I, with my intellectual, if you like, intelligence, my knowledge of international law. I don't see anything in international law that speaks about if there's a ticking bomb, you can evade what the Torture Convention says. Torture is torture is torture. You go to Argentina, torture is torture is torture. You go to Chile, torture is torture is torture. Because generations of people were subjected to torture. They know what it is. They've been through it. And they don't convert what is a huge historical, experiential thing that's deep in the souls and bones of a nation into a set of imaginary situations to be dealt with at a purely instrumental level. A theme that's often left out, this is my third story on terrorism, is state terrorism. Far more people have been mutilated, exterminated, massacred, and killed through state terrorism than through terrorism by what are called irregular groups. In huge magnitudes greater than that. And in addition to the greater power that states normally have to kill, to maim, to torture, to abuse, they also have the power to control the media, to silence, to terrorize people who otherwise might be witnesses. I didn't take part in the armed struggle. My job was as a lawyer, as a writer, somebody active internationally. Anti-apartheid movement, open divestment in this country. The armed struggle came to me, the form of state terrorism, a bomb put in my car by South African security agents in Mozambique. I survived. Ruth first didn't survive the letter bomb that was sent to her in the nearby Center for African Studies at the university there. I felt triumphant. This moment that as a freedom fighter you spend every day waiting for and wondering, will it be today, will it be tonight, will it be tomorrow, will I be courageous when it happens to me? And I survived. I even told myself a joke as I was coming to after a 7-hour operation. I didn't know about the operation. It was total darkness. I'd heard a voice saying something about a car bomb and your arm is in vulnerable condition. And I felt light on that, in the darkness, lying on sort of a stretcher. And the joke many of you would have heard, you might even heard it from me, Jaime Cohen falls off a bus and does this, and someone says, Jaime, I didn't know, you're Catholic. He said, what do you mean Catholic? Spectacles, testicles, wallet and watch. And when I describe it in the soft ventral freedom fighter, I say I started, in fact, with testicles. All in place, they'll get me into trouble like they have done in the past. And my hand goes up. Wallet, it's okay. Spectacle, no craters in my head. And my hand slides down. And then I realize I've lost an arm. I've only lost an arm. And I fainted into a sense of delirium which hasn't left me. That was April 7th, April 8th, 1988, almost 20 years ago, and that delirium, that excitement, that sense of, as I recover, my country's going to recover, has been sustained all this time. How should one respond to actions and activities like that? Years later, I get a phone call. It's reception saying there's a man called Henry come to see you. Sent him through. Henry had telephoned me earlier in the week to say that he had organized the placing of the bomb in my car. He was now going to go to the Truth Commission. Would I see him in the bombs? And I said yes. I was curious. And I go to the security door, we open the door, and I see somebody a little shorter than myself, younger, thin like I am, And he's looking at me, I'm looking at him. So this is the man who tried to kill me, and I can see him saying, so this is the man I tried to kill. We hadn't fought over anything, over love, passion, money, ambition. We didn't even know each other. And as we walked down the corridor to my chambers, I remember he strode like a soldier, and I tried to delay him with my best judge's ambulatory stroll. He sat down, we talked. And eventually I stood up and I said, Henry, I have to go on with my work, but go to the Truth Commission. Tell them what you know. Do something for South Africa. Who knows, maybe one day. I can't shake your hand now, but who knows, one day we might meet. And as he walked back, I remember he walked with the shuffle of a soldier in retreat, and he went out the security door. The Truth Commission was such a powerful experience for us in South Africa. And so many stories were told, and many have been captured. It wasn't the facts, the data, the information, even the conclusions that was important. It was seeing the faces, hearing the voices, the tears, the apologies, the defenses for those who'd been guilty and were now trying to get amnesty. It was real, it was our people. It wasn't some strange person out there, the enemy, the torturers, the security police. It was Sergeant so-and-so. It was Mrs. Mtinkulu speaking about her son, who came home and the hair was falling out and he died of poisoning afterwards. It was so real, it was so vivid. And of all the many stories that were told, the one that stood out the strongest, you know, you have some memories that just stand out. Something symbolizes so much. It was the exchange between Tony Ngeni, who'd been in the ANC resistance, who'd been tortured by Sergeant Benzine, and Sergeant Benzine was now asking for amnesty. Tony Ngeni was having his chance to tell his story. And he said, Sergeant Benzine, show the commission how you would put wet canvas bags over our heads and smother us until we thought we were drowning, that we would suffocate and die. And an orderly lay on the floor, not a wet bag, but an ordinary bag was put over the head and held there. Show us how you held it there, how long you held it there. And then Sergeant Benzine stood up afterwards. And Tony Ngeni said, can you explain how can one human being do this to another human being? And Sergeant Benzine started crying. This man who'd had power of life and death, who terrorized others, started crying. His eyes were puffy, his cheeks were red, the tears were coming down. We saw this state terrorist. People died under his hands. We saw him crying. But he was asked that simple question, how can one person do this to another person? And somehow that became the thematic of the whole Truth Commission. How can people do these things to other people? It was a sense of horror, abomination, the values of a society that was at stake. It wasn't just a question of calculating losses and gains in some kind of scaling and weighing up. It's a question of who are we? What are we about? What characterizes our society? Do we have shame? Do we have shame? What are the sort of things that we are ashamed about? That must never happen again. Whoever does it, for whatever motivation. You might have believed in your cause at that stage, but there's some things human beings don't do to other human beings. So it's never again, never again, never again. We've got to learn from this experience. And it was that image that became the central image of the whole Truth and Reconciliation procedure. Later in that year, I went to a party. We worked very hard. The music was loud. I was tired, and I hear a voice saying, "Albie, Albie!" I look up. Oh God, it's Henry. It turned out these were filmmakers, and they were doing a documentary on the soldier who'd gone to the Truth Commission. And he was absolutely elated. His eyes were shining. And he came up to me, and he said, "Albie, you said to me," and we got into a corner where the noise wasn't so loud, we could engage. And he said, "I spoke to Farouk and Sue, using first name terms of people who've been in exile with me who also could have been victims of the bomb. And you said that maybe one day." And I said, "Henry, I've only got your face to tell me that what you're saying is the truth." I put out my hand, I shook his hand. He went away floating on air. I almost fainted. But I heard afterwards that he went home for 2 weeks, and the people couldn't understand. He was just crying for 2 weeks. And that moved me very much. Sending him to jail, blowing off his arm, what good would that have done me? To get democracy in South Africa, as I wrote, roses and lilies will grow out of my arm. That would be my self-vengeance. The last time I looked, I didn't see any roses and lilies. But the democracy we've got, that's so much more powerful than doing to them what they're doing to you. That's what I call my self-vengeance. That vow that I'd made already in prison during the solitary confinement was now somehow playing itself out in my life, not as an ideology, but as an existential guide, orientation for the kind of person I wanted to be, the kind of country I wanted to live in. The fourth tale of terrorism. I'm now wearing a green gown, and I'm sitting not in a mock court, but in a real court. And there are 11 of us. And we have 3 cases that I'm going to mention today and conclude with that. Dealing terrorism, violence, the right to a fair trial, the right to be accused. One of my fellow judges had been on Robben Island for 10 years. Others had been involved in the struggle. None had had the specific experiences that I'd had. Many had had experiences of gross indignities, not only growing up in poverty, but being stripped naked, hosed down because they were black. So it's a very kind of mixed court. And we are guided by the Constitution, this Constitution that emerged out of our historical experience. And I'm convinced, by the way, if we hadn't taken these principal decisions in the 1980s on the question of torture, on the question of who the enemy is and methods of struggle, we would never have got the Constitution we got. We were preparing our Bill of Rights in the heart of our struggle in relation to our own sense of honor and dignity and the reason, the justification, the foundation of what the struggle was about. We were establishing those standards there and then. Now we have a constitution. Now we judges. And a case came to us of a Mr. Muhammad, who apparently had been involved, he was about 20 years old at the time, in the blowing up of the American embassy in Dar es Salaam. It was a terrible, terrible act. It killed about 60 people, the majority Tanzanians. It was an act not only aimed at civilians, it was aimed at international law, at an international diplomatic institution. And he came down to Cape Town under a false name. and he registered as a refugee. The FBI heard that he was there. They didn't know who he was. They had a photograph. And they waited and watched as people came in to renew their documentation. And when he turned up, they discovered this is Mohammed. They pounced on him. They got the South African immigration authorities to lock him up. And within 36 hours, he was flying in an American military plane through what was called rendition to stand trial in New York on a capital charge of murder. His employer was a confectioner who just knew there was a young guy who was actually a very good pastry cook. He said he didn't know what was going on. I tried to get a lawyer for him. They told me he's not allowed a lawyer. He's been deported, illegal alien. He brought a case in the Cape High Court. The Cape High Court said he's an illegal alien. He's being deported. He can't claim any rights. He came to the Constitutional Court. And we said no. It was a unanimous decision. First of all, everybody is entitled, whatever they've done, to legal counsel. It's in our Bill of Rights. It applies to people being charged with the most abominable crimes, to people maybe being indicted for very trivial offences. It's a principle of our society. It's fundamental to our new constitution. But that had passed. He's now on his way. What was of greater concern to us was not that he was being put on trial. He deserved to be put on trial. He deserved to be punished. He deserved to be held accountable for participating in something absolutely horrific. But we didn't feel he deserved to be executed. Because our Constitution, the way we've interpreted it, does not permit the state to take life through judicial executions. That's a violation of the right to human dignity, and we regard it as a cruel, inhuman, degrading punishment. And we declared that. And one of his co-accused, who'd been extradited from Germany, was given an assurance by the American government. He's put on trial, he will not be executed. But that's Germany. It's a European, developed country. We are just South Africa at the bottom of the African continent. Rendition applies there. We just really felt that was implicit in what was happening. What could we do now? We declared that it had been unlawful on the part of the South African authorities to hand him over without first getting an assurance that he would not be executed if found guilty. That was a declaration. How could be a declaration possibly help him? We couldn't order our foreign affairs to send a gunboat to New York to rescue him. And these are very delicate, complicated questions, separation of powers involved. So we decided to send a copy of our judgment to the judge who was presiding at the trial for him to see whether or not it should be made available to the jury. In the end, the jury decided 7-5, I think, against capital punishment for him. That was in about May 2001, before 9/11. It's been afterwards, I don't know what the result would have been. But we took a decision as a matter of principle. Whatever the person has done, we don't execute. We might have said whatever the person does, we don't torture. Because these things are against the values of our society. And these things are central to a dignitarian society where it's not just freedom and community, it's dignity, it's based on human dignity. Values play such an important role in all our judicial reasoning. The values of our new society, values based on the pains of the past, the things that we suffered, and values based on the aspirations of the kind of country that we want. That was Mohammed. The second case was about somebody the newspapers called Dr. Death, quoted a song. Very talented cardiologist who'd been the head of the bacteriological and chemical warfare department of the South African military in the later apartheid period. And he was charged with multiple charges of fraud. We don't have juries, the judge found him not guilty. But very grave charges of conspiring in South Africa to send asphyxiating poisons to Namibia, then called South West Africa, to inject into the freedom fighters from an organization called SWAPO, South Africa People's Organization, and fly them in aeroplanes over the sea and dump them in the sea, as was being done in Argentina. There's a terrible internationalism. We speak about internationalism of human rights organizations, freedom fighters. There's an internationalism of torturers as well. And they swap techniques and technology, and this was something like 200 people allegedly injected by him. The judge said, you can't try someone in South Africa for conspiracy to commit an offense outside our borders and quash the charges. The state appealed to the Supreme Court of Appeal, who threw out the appeal on various grounds, some of them purely procedural and technical. Didn't get to that issue. The matter came to our court. We decided that the judge had been completely wrong to quash the charges. If you conspire in South Africa to use the instrumentality of the defense force in South Africa across the borders, there's a continuity of conduct. It's not fortuitous that it's in another country. And there were other reasons as well. Namibia was like a colony of South Africa, and he was moving to and fro and allegedly applying the poisons himself. He should have been charged. Then he said, I'm being subjected to double jeopardy. We said, we can't decide that. It would be, if he's put on trial again, the trial court would have to decide. And in the end, the prosecution felt, after all the years that had passed, there wasn't enough evidence. Some evidence had been laid on these serious charges in the trial, and he wasn't prosecuted. Now, I mention this case for two reasons. One is the court wrote very, very strongly on the duty to prosecute war crimes under the Geneva Conventions. It's a duty the state has. It's not a maybe. It has a duty. And that was part and parcel of saying why it was wrong. Do you use the word quash here? Quash the charge? To strike down the charges. But I wrote a separate judgment where I set out the horrendous acts being alleged against him. But I ended up by saying, none of this means that he's not entitled to a fair trial. And in fact, when people are charged with horrendous activities like this, it becomes, if anything, more, not less important to maintain the basic standards of a fair trial. Particularly people who are challenging the very notion of legality and international law. Because you're doing more than just holding an individual to account for a violation of the domestic and international. You are reaffirming international law, you're reaffirming standards. And you want to show that we are different from them. You want to establish, through the fairness of the procedure, even if it's going to lead to an acquittal, you want to establish what it is you are defending, what it is you're all about. And I wrote that judgment, it really came from my heart. I didn't feel kindly towards this person, but that was quite irrelevant. It's quite irrelevant. On the judge, I'm sitting up there. I did feel passionately and strongly that whatever distaste I might have felt because of the indictment had to be totally counteracted by the need to ensure that our standards would not be vitiated in any way because of the horrendous character of these offences he's allegedly committed. The last case I'm referring to, called Kaunda, it was very paradoxical, was the families of these alleged mercenaries came rushing to court in South Africa to say, but we have a Bill of Rights, they have basic rights, they're not being treated fairly. It was a wonderful paradox. I was so thrilled and pleased that people who belonged to a community that possibly showed total disrespect for the rule of law and rights, when they were in trouble, invoked the Bill of Rights. And they claimed that their husbands, their lovers, their brothers, their sons were facing torture. If they were sent on, they would be executed without a fair trial. And we must apply the South African Bill of Rights to protect them. We couldn't delay. It's the kind of case where you'd like a few months to do a lot of international research, but it's no good coming up with a beautiful judgment after they've been executed. So we had to move quickly. We actually sat in recess because of the urgency. And I remember saying, possibly incautiously, from the bench, dealing with the nature of the application, you go into a lion's den and you're surprised when you discover there's a lion there. And you say, I half regretted it afterwards, making that possibly injudicious but very realistic comment. Now, how could we as a court respond to that situation? We decided fairly early on in our discussions, we can't apply the South African Bill of Rights to foreign jurisdictions. It's our Bill of Rights. It applies to people inside South Africa, citizens and non-citizens. And we can't give an extraterritorial application. And there was what authority we could get made that very, very clear. Did that mean there was nothing we could do? No. There was a clause in our Constitution that spoke about the rights of citizens to protection from the state, protection by the state. And we allied this to international law principles. And we said that there was a duty on the South African state, on our government, to ensure that universally accepted principles of international law applied as much as they could, ensure that they applied to South Africans abroad. It's more than just consular access. That's done through treaty. This was part and parcel of the role that customary international law plays in our constitutional order. Our Constitution expressly requires us to apply international law unless it's expressly excluded by internal statute. And these were principles of international customary law. I think we would have liked to have said the death penalty violates customary international law. We couldn't. We could point to a growing move in that direction, but we couldn't say it's become a hard and fast principle of customary international law. But there were two principles that applied. And we said that our state is under an obligation to do everything within its power, choosing its own methods, because we don't dictate to foreign affairs how they should conduct their affairs, but everything possible, first of all, to ensure a right to a fair trial. That's part of customary international law. We don't punish people for offences unless they've had a fair trial. The definition of fairness might vary depending on the culture, the traditions of different countries, but the basic fairness, the right to challenge, to understand what the case is against you, to testify, not to testify, all these things must be established. And the right not to be tortured. International law, customary international law, forbids the use of torture. It's not just now the signatories to the Torture Convention. It's become part and parcel of obligatory customary international law. It's understood as such throughout the world. And we said that to the extent that our foreign affairs could intervene at all, using whatever methods, diplomatic methods, available to them, to ensure that these people, however terrible their objectives might be, would not be subjected to torture. They are obliged to do so. It's not a choice, it's a legal obligation on them to do so. We cannot very, very clearly to that extent. So in the three cases where we've had to make decisions in our court, they've been made on questions of principle, upholding the basic values of human dignity, supporting the kind of country we want to be, the core values of society that we feel need to be protected. And right at the heart of this is not subjecting human beings to mutilation, to abuse, to attempts to destroy their will, to beatings, to wooding, to suffocations, to electric shocks, to sleep deprivation, to all these things that through our historical experience we know amount to torture. Absolutely out. No qualifications, no exemptions, no hypotheticals. We want to live in a country where people don't torture other people, and in particular the state, as the great exemplar, doesn't torture. Thank you.
Although, in a way, it's anticlimactic to even consider entertaining questions. If you'd be willing to take a couple, I think it would be just wonderful. Yeah, that could.
You talked about
But can I say, please don't give me a hypothetical.
Actually, that's kind of the heart of my question. You mentioned that we are talking hypotheticals, and that you said that you come from an experience where it's an experiential matter rather than a hypothetical one. And at what point does it become an experience? Because you talked about, within Argentina, within South Africa, it was this institutionalized state regime. At what point does it reach that? Because, within our current foreign affairs, we've admitted the fact that there have been instances of what would necessarily constitute torture under customary international law. But they're very limited instances. And so what point does that happen, and at what point do you begin to have that sense of shame that you talked about? And also, is that sense of shame affected by the fact that it's others versus, whereas in South Africa and Argentina, it's the people against themselves?
I'm very respectful of your debate in your context. It's a cultural, it's an historical thing. I can't take part in it because it's overwhelming for me. I don't, one trivializes the experience of Holocaust survivors, but maybe that helps people to understand sometimes that it's so deep, it's so powerful, it's so felt by our whole generation, and I might say in South Africa, it's so related to racism, to white domination, to a sense of superiority, to dehumanization, to categorizing people outside of humanity, that it ceases to be a logical conundrum, and I can't take part in it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have it. I think it's a brilliant endeavor that you have here, but for me it's just intolerable. I'm giving you a factual statement now, and I suspect that you just couldn't have a debate like this. I said that before in the Argentine, where it became visceral, where it affected whole generations. And it wasn't only that these things happened, they were denied, they were justified. And somehow the justification and the wriggling and the technical arguments made it worse. They made it worse. Because it's taking something from the level of brutal, ugly behavior and converting it into a sanitized, kind of logical conundrum. There's something heartless and something vitally opposed to the very nature of the Bill of Rights that's involved in. But, you haven't been through that experience. It might be in parts of the South, certainly after the lynching experiences and so on. People would say there are just some issues you can't discuss about the length of the rope and how long it took to kill the people and so on. It's just horrific. It's antithetical. So that's something for your consciences and for you to debate. I'm just giving my own response. And why, I mean, I've got other things on tomorrow anyhow, and I'm tired and I'm trying to write. Even if I've been tempted to come, and some of the titles are very exciting, and I'd love to hear Susan speaking or moderating and so on, I just can't emotionally because I can't participate in that kind of discussion which I think you need here. I personally can't do.
Yes.
I just wonder, when you were being subjected to the torture or whatever you want to call it, was there ever anything you said that for the moment affected the people that you were talking to? Or that were dealing with you?
For my first detention, I had no one to speak to. I was alone most of the time. The only people I could speak to were my interrogators. It gives you a sort of dependence on them. And I might say, when I came out from 168 days, and I didn't know it to be 168, you know, when you're working to a target and it's easier to measure, it could have been endless. I'm puzzled. Why is it so hard to be brave? Why did I want to speak to them all the time? Why did I feel dependent? Why did I welcome them coming? And that pushed me into, from a very behaviorist, psychological, analytical point of view, into the unconscious. And I read a biography of Freud, and I read volume 1 of Freud's collected works, and volume 2 I went up to volume 5. And it took me years to get out of it, because I reached the stage where I would say, why is my left foot in front of my right foot when I'm crossing the street? Everything had to be determined by the unconscious. So it was very paradoxical, very kind of a strange thing. But there was a game we were playing. And what I said to interrogators then was, well, they'd say to me, are you prepared to answer our questions? And I say, if I don't know what the questions are, how can I say whether I'll answer them? And they say, but if we tell you what the questions are, then we're giving things away. And it was sort of a game. I kept it up. Maybe if they'd timed the interventions better, they would have got me. You know, there were moments when I was very fragile. I had out-of-body experiences. I was almost willing to talk. The second time, it was a team down from Johannesburg, and it was totally different. It wasn't discussion with me, conversation. They were an experienced team of interrogators, not just smart interrogators. Their job was to break you down, to destroy you. And they killed people. And it's a strange thing that privilege follows you even when you're being interrogated as an enemy of the state. Some white people were given electric shock torture, made to stand on bricks. But basically it's the black prisoners who got the most horrendous forms of torture. I was sitting down. You know, privilege follows you even in those particular circumstances. And there was a very curious game we played at the end, where I felt that if I'm making a statement, at least I'm going to say, I'm making the statement under duress, retrieving a tiny bit of dignity. And I started off saying, I'm making this statement under duress after I collapsed, brought the cord on me, eyes prized open several times, so many hours of interrogation. And I'm very tired, I'm desperately tired, and I'm not really in control of what's happening. And I just noticed this Lieutenant Swanepoel, Roy Riss, and just by the way, to me, fair, ugly, people are people. No, you don't like people. He cultivated ugliness. He flopped his hair short, his eyes were bloodshot. He dressed badly. He shouted. He thumped the table. He enjoyed being like a brute. And I sensed he was getting me to sign pages. And afterwards I realized he'd just rewritten some portions and elided, cut out those bits. I felt even more humiliated afterwards that he had defeated even my tiny little feeble attempt at protest. When I went to the National Archive a couple of years ago, I was asked to do a lecture on archives. What do I know about archives? But I love giving lectures on things I know nothing about. It draws you in, and you can say interesting things, and people have no expectations of you. And I went to our National Archive as a matter of courtesy. I decided to let me look up the documents on my own past. The security documents had all been shredded and thrown away, but there were some documents from the Ministry of Justice. And some were fairly interesting, and then I came across, can you remember the days when we had carbon copies and flimsies before computers? Any of you remember that? Sure. And here was this piece of paper, like something from Noah's Ark, you know, from ancient times. And it was a statement I'd made to a visiting magistrate about how I'd been subjected to that interrogation and complaint. I felt absolutely elated. This little document, it was almost like Swanepoel had died, but it was a posthumous macho triumph on my part that he hadn't destroyed the evidence for the future. But that's part of the terror of torture. It's secret, it's denied, it's suppressed. It's a continuing humiliation for the tortured person. That what's been the worst experience of your whole life doesn't exist. It never happened. It never happened. It's obliterated. And that's why this little record for me was so important. There was never any personal, you know, some people are brave and they stand up and they fight and they shoot. I was always well behaved. I was brought up as a well-behaved person, even when I was blown up and I didn't know what was happening and I was being dragged into a car. In fact, people who saved my life took me to the hospital. I thought I'd been kidnapped and taken to South Africa. And I shouted in Portuguese and English, but not too loudly. I wrote off because I'm a lawyer in a public place. Don't treat me like this. And I felt if they take me in a car, I felt terrible pains. At least they could have decent springs in the car. So, you know, I wasn't one of these persons who bared my breast and said, do what you dare. You know, on the contrary, I'm a conciliator. I wouldn't say I'm a coward, but I'm a softie. So there was never that spark between us. I was privileged. I was white. I wasn't subject to that extra form of racial abuse.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, and we're going to adjourn now to a reception outside in the hall where you can all meet and talk with Justice Sachs. So thank you once again.